Welcome to Kali Tribune podcast, and this is the episode in our ongoing series Basic Notions of Metaphysics. The notion that we'll define today is the notion of nature, as is found in Aristotle. Without further ado, let's give definition. Nature is intrinsic principle of movement. In order to explain what this means, we have to explain what is principle, what is intrinsic, and what is movement. So only on KT you get 3 things for the price of no thing, while we advertise getting 1 thing. So let us proceed further. We'll start with the intrinsic. What does intrinsic or interior mean? Well, this means that if something is intrinsic, it can be comprehended potentially from itself. This, of course, means that it is in a certain sense autonomous, as opposed to something that is heteronomous, that is outside, that is, for instance, caused from the outside. So to give you an example, bed has an extrinsic cause of existence in every conceivable way. Also, it has extrinsic cause of movement. If the bed moves, this doesn't mean that it is some kind of automatic bed that is moving by itself, but it is moved by being pushed or pulled or something like that. Whereas when something is intrinsic, be it principle, cause, or whatever, the activity comes from the inside. Now, as always, in traditional metaphysics, there are multiple layers to this meaning, and in different contexts, this thing can even mean something seemingly opposite. To clarify, let us proceed further with defining our terms. The second would be principle, and this is very important. Especially it is very important in the context of understanding of what is nature in Aristotle's understanding. Principle is usually thought about as identical with cause, causa, aition in Greek. But this is not true. Every cause is a principle, but not every principle is a cause. I'll give you an example. Or better, I'll give you Aristotle's example. He says at one point in his Delta book of his Metaphysics that Hellenes, that is Greeks, are called Hellenes according to Helen, the founding father, let's call him, of their nation. Is the Hellen cause of particular Greek, like Aristotle, being born? No, he isn't. He is not efficient cause, as Aristotle would say. That is the cause of movement, the active cause of particular Greek. He is the principle because he is considered to be the first. So he is not necessarily the cause. This is very important to bear in mind. So what are we looking for here is the meaning of the definition. The nature is intrinsic principle of movement. So nature, please remember, is not intrinsical cause of movement. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. And a lot of Aristotle experts, people with 30 to 40 years of studying Aristotle under their belt, sometimes fail to understand this. And I'm not saying this because I consider myself exceptional luminary about these matters, but because the other more succinct scholars of Aristotle and classical metaphysics in general point this out. This is because the errors in understanding ancient philosophers or traditional philosophers in general mostly occurs in not seeing the obvious, not seeing the presumptions that they don't lay out for you because they consider them to be natural. So then what happens is that you unconsciously read into them some of your own prejudices, more precisely the worldview in which you are born. And we are born in the modern and postmodern worldview that is completely alien to this kind of thinking. Whereas this kind of thinking, by which I mean traditional metaphysics, is in its turn not alien to anything. You can be alienated from it, but it never alienates from you because it is in reality. And you can always rediscover it. In fact, quite not easily, but quite simply, because Aristotle being the prime example of this, classical philosophy, metaphysics, traditional metaphysics starts from from assumptions that are very near to everyday living, that are from the midst of everyday living. And everybody, of course, participates in everyday living. So let us proceed further from this digression. We are left with defining movement. Movement, according to Aristotle, and I'll paraphrase the precise definition from his Physics, is the passage from possibility into actuality, from dynamis to energeia, of a thing that is capable, that is to say, which possesses possibility of that energeia in which it passes. It's a bit of a mouthful, but I'll explain. So kinesis, or movement, or even better to say process, is a kind of mid-phenomena. It is something between what is ultimately real, which for Aristotle means energeia, from something that is ultimately unreal, which means dynamis, or potentia, or possibility. Possibility cannot exist in itself. It exists only on the basis of already existing reality. Reality, however, being understood as energeia. So what we today call reality, primarily physical reality, in a peculiar modern way, would roughly correspond to what Aristotle calls sublunary sphere, or nature on the planet Earth, to put it bluntly. But this kind of reality is in fact aggregate, or the organism of movements, because movement is the primary substance, let's say not substance, a being of nature. If you want to understand nature, Aristotle would say, you have to understand movement. But nature is not ultimate reality, and nature is not criterion by which you depict reality. The criterion is energeia. And I avoid translating the word because I want you to feel the impact of it. Because when I say actuality, you probably already have some understanding, preconceived some understanding of what actuality means. And that doesn't need to correspond with Aristotle's original meaning. When I say energeia, then I'll put you into a position that you have to think about it. This is why I do it. So energeia is a criterion because movement is understood from it. Energeia is the purpose of movement. So, for instance, if I conceive the child, the purpose of the movement of conceiving that then transmutes in the movement of gestation and generation is an actual being, a child, a personal being, to put things on even higher level. So the child would be energeia, whereas my initial act would be, in this sense, a potency, or it is not really a potency when looked in when observed in itself. I'll give you another more simple example. You have an acorn and you have an oak. Well, the acorn is what scholastics would call prima materia of the oak tree, because acorn exists in order for oak tree to come to pass. But as such, it has already contained oak tree in implicit potential sense that then develops into its full actuality. This is typical Aristotelian example, and mind you, this applies to all metaphysics, not only Aristotle. Never forget this term energeia, which is very important. This is not Plato's term. This is not Maximus the Confessor's term. This is not Thomas Aquinas' terms. This is Aristotle's term. So it is not accident that everybody uses it, whether it be in original or in Latin translation, and even later in German translation of Wirklichkeit. Because this is very important, because sometimes people take Aristotle in isolation as a kind of man that had certain opinions that are in conflict, for instance, with opinions of somebody like Plato, who was his teacher and of whom Aristotle had critical remarks. The thing is that traditional philosophers in antiquity and Middle Ages always, or almost always, took them together. Criticism notwithstanding, criticism served more like a clarification, but the most Platonic of philosophers, Neoplatonics, made great use of Aristotle, and even never tried to make a kind of synthesis between Aristotle and Plato, in the sense that you have a feeling that they are consciously doing it. No. They just naturally take them together. This is very important also to keep in mind. It's a bit of digression in relation to a subject, but it is good to keep in mind nevertheless. Why not say it? So, nature is intrinsic principle of movement. Now, someone might object, and indeed it was objected to Aristotle, that this is in fact the definition of life. That Aristotle's understanding of nature is understanding of living nature, and it doesn't apply to dead things, to immovable things, that motionless things without life. There is a merit to this objection only if we don't understand it as objection, but as a partial understanding of Aristotle, because indeed Aristotle understands nature from life and from thinking, because life and thought are higher levels or higher forms of energeia than kinesis. Life is not movement for Aristotle. Life is energeia. It is materially based upon movement, as it is materially based upon body in human beings and animals, but as such, its form or its essence, in itself terms that need definition, but not this time, are not movement and are not material, because there is no intrinsic potentiality or possibility in the energeia of life in its pure sense, or energeia of thought. Now, to put this aside for a moment and not to run before ourselves, let us get back to this principality or nature being principle. The people who object to Aristotle that his understanding of nature is biological, absolutely biological, are wrong insofar as they think that he uses principle in the sense of the cause, whereas he is not. The cause is something, for Aristotle, from which the Greek expression is exou, comes something else. The cause is, to translate it into our philosophical terminology, the act or agent that gives being to something else. So if nature is a cause, nature should be in some sense being effusing, not really creative. We must understand this and keep this in mind. Creation is different kind of causality than nature. In Aristotle, and also later, very importantly, in Christian philosophy, where creation becomes central, and creation as not being really natural act, very important to bear in mind. So if nature would be a cause, nature can be a cause, of course, but if nature is unqualifiedly always a cause, then nature is always an active cause, because everything that creates an effect acts, whereas act means energeia. Everything is energizing, let's say. Everything is effusing something from itself, because causality in classical terms should be primarily understood as a procession from something, or pouring out of something, not in a mechanical way of two billiard balls colliding, as is normal in modern philosophy. David Hume loved I think, if I remember correctly, this example has got this completely misleading metaphor of what causality is. Anyway, but nature doesn't have to be that. Nature can be a potential principle, because potentiality, although hierarchically lower than actuality, is also a principle. It is something from which, but not by which, something comes to pass. If I have intrinsic potentiality to conceive a child, this intrinsic potentiality is a principle. It's not a cause, because cause for me to conceive a child is something else. It's a certain form of activity that is not polite to talk about here. Anyway, potentiality as principle is present in all things, a potentiality of movement, in all natural things. It is not present in artifacts, for instance, because intrinsic potentiality of movement in bed, that is an artifact, is accidental. It is not, in fact, intrinsic. So the bed possesses the principle of heaviness. I'll explain in a moment why this example. Not because it is a bed, but because it is made of wood. And wood as hard material possesses the intrinsic principle of heaviness that puts it in that makes it incline to go down, literally. The thing is that Aristotle's Physica, Aristotle's philosophy or analysis of nature, is not interested in laws of nature. It is not interested in nature beyond living nature and moving nature of the planet Earth, in fact, if I can put it like that, sublunar world, as he calls it, for very important reasons that are not obsolete in our day and age. We just took a different path. Nature, for him, therefore, is provided with intrinsic qualities. It is as a principle an intrinsic quality. If a fire has an intrinsic quality of lightness, same as the light, This is its inner principle of movement, but not the cause of its movement, because fire does not cause itself to go up, for instance, to go up in the air. The efficient causes of this are different, but its potentiality is to act like this. So this is Aristotle's understanding, and mind you, it is anything but naive. And it comes to him because his motives are specific, different than physicists of today would choose. Because today they are looking for laws of possibility of, in fact, technical manipulation of things. Aristotle is interested in substances and the answers to a question, what is. So he asks, what is time, what is movement, what is this, and what is that. And this implies also knowing the causes. But this already goes in the first philosophy, or so-called metaphysics. Modern physicists do not do that. Rest assured. You don't have to have PhD in physics to know this, because it's obvious from the way they ask questions and use these terms that Aristotle uses. So, that would be more or less Aristotle's understanding of the nature as the inner principle of movement. There are other uses of the expression nature that are different, and this is typical for modern traditional metaphysics, because sometimes the same word is used in different contexts, even to define something completely opposite. The reason why this is happening, and with this I will conclude the episode of the podcast, is the nature of traditional thought. It is not systematic. It is always organic whole, but it is not a system. And this is something that is very hard to wrap your mind around if you are a modern man, because we think in a form of systems. A system is a closed whole of correct inferences, let's say, but it is dead. There is no movement in it. It is not analysis of actual analysis of something. Aristotle's philosophy is actual analysis, and analysis is always understood as something, in fact, opposite to what would be now called, for instance, English analytic, British analytic philosophy. It's complete opposite, but never mind that. Now, I talked about it a lot before, and therefore there is a whole, but you cannot grasp this whole, this body of knowledge in its entirety at every moment. It is more like something that is given to you as a light in which you are moving. And the words in this context are the last thing in importance. Because the first thing in importance is reality in the sense of energia, let's remember. The other thing is thought, that is the intellectual mode of energia in the last instance. And the last thing is word, to denote these two things. Whereas today we seem to go from the other way around, from words to thoughts to reality, and between those three there is a gap of nothingness that is pretty incomprehensible, and nobody knows how to bridge it. But that's, of course, different matter entirely. Thank you for your attention. This is Branko Malic of Kali Tribune signing out.